Down, the government bailouts, trillion-dollar deficits, and it's all been presented. This was really a good thing. American taxpayers and the government are getting paid back. But there's another side to the credit crisis you may not have heard of. All is not what it appears to be. Joining me on the program is G. Edward Griffin. He's the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, which has just been re-released and updated in its 5th edition. And Mr. Griffin, I want to start out in your chapter, Protectors of the Public. In your previous editions, you talked about the bailouts of Penn Central, Continental, Illinois, Chrysler. But there's a part of the subprime meltdown that investors weren't aware of, and it's the way the whole system works. And that is, from a banking perspective, the banks went and made these reckless loans, no documentation. And they did that because in the background, in the back of their minds, they always felt, you know what, we've got the Fed. If we get into trouble, they'll bail us out. So let's begin with what encouraged them to go out and make these reckless loans.
Well, Jim, I think you described it pretty well. In the insurance business, that's what they call a moral hazard. When there is no real risk involved because of one reason or another, if there's no risk, then people are willing to do things knowing that they're going to be bailed out. That's the old joke about, burning down the restaurant because you're only making $50,000 a year, but if you burn down your restaurant and make it look like an accident, you've got the insurance and can collect $5 million. So, that's moral hazard. And there's moral hazard built right into the banking system ever since the Federal Reserve System was created. And that was part of the plan. They knew from the very beginning that if they could partner with the federal government, and then go through the appearance of being regulated by the federal government, which was more of a mirage than anything else. Actually, it was more the other way around. The banks eventually developed so much power over the government that it seemed like they were the regulators and the government were the ones being regulated. But anyway, that's another issue. Yeah, they knew from the beginning that as long as they were partnered, that somewhere down the line, if they ever got into trouble, as you said, that they would be bailed out with taxpayers' money. And that's what I wrote about when I published this book way back in 1994. And it had already happened by that time on numerous occasions, but I was able to see that this mechanism was very firmly entrenched and it was gaining momentum, and I could see that in the future, which is now come to pass, that the bailout mechanism was going to just continue to go, and there would be much more of it and much more devastating effects in the economy. And the average bloke out there, the average guy that I consider myself to be part of that group, the average public, they don't know anything about that. I didn't know anything about that till I decided some years ago to make it an object of my investigation. Most people don't have the time for that. I'm fortunate because that's my business. I can decide I'm going to investigate something, and I can take out months or years if necessary. But the average person on the street, he doesn't have time for that. He's got to make a living. He's got his own profession. He's got his own job. He's got his family to worry about, and so forth. So the average person pretty well just takes what they hear on the radio or on the television. So I guess that's what's happening, and they never have an opportunity to question it. But the bottom line, Jim, as you so well know, is that this whole banking cartel called the Federal Reserve System is nothing but a system of legalized plunder of the American taxpayer. And it should be more obvious nowadays, but apparently it's not. People are upset, but they still don't understand what's going on. They want something to happen, but they don't know what, and they turn to the very same people that have pulled the scam on them in the past, and those are the people that are asking for solutions. So you know right from that they really don't understand what's going on.
Well, everybody remembers hearing about the TARP bailout of $700 billion, but as you talk in your book, by the end of 2008, the bailout of the financial service industry in the Bush administration alone had reached $7 trillion. Now, there's an interesting comment that you made in the fall of 2008, after they let Lehman go under. Then you saw a series of dominoes, Merrill Lynch being one of them. Bank of America agreed to buy the ailing firm for $50 billion, a strange offer considering that Bank of America itself received $25 billion in the bailout.
Yes.
And then once the bank found out how bad the losses were, they tried to bail out. And Ken Lewis at that time wanted to bail out, and he got a call from Hank Paulson. Let's talk about what happened and how this bailout went through.
Well, sure. Yeah, as you said, Lewis had decided that it was not a good deal for the Bank of America to acquire Merrill Lynch because they had so many debts that they didn't know about originally. It was all buried in the books, but by the time their accountants got in there and really looked into the books, they realized that there was a tremendous liability and that they didn't think they could survive it. So the board of directors at B of A, under the guidance of Lewis, said, well, we can't go through with this. Well, then he got a call from the Treasury Secretary Paulson and made what you might call a demand of Lewis. He said, no, you have to buy Merrill Lynch. You just have to do it. And Lewis said, well, Mr. Paulson, that's easy for you to say, but we cannot pick up the losses. It would surely sink our little ship. We don't have to come back to the government again and ask for another $1 billion or $5 billion or $100 billion, and that's what we would have to do. And Paulson said, look, I have been requested by Mr. Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve System, to tell you that you must buy Merrill Lynch because we do not want it to fold, and we will cover you. We will make sure that you will not lose anything. If you have these losses, we'll provide the money to you in one way or another, or we'll give it to you as a credit. We'll make sure that you do not lose on this deal. And Lewis, and by the way, we know this because Lewis testified. He made this public statement. He almost word for word what I'm saying. And Lewis said, well, that changes everything, Mr. Bernanke. I don't know whether that's a good thing or not for the American people, but if you're going to guarantee it, I guess we have to reconsider it. It would certainly be good for Bank of America. But would you put that in writing so, I can take it to the board of directors? And here was the thing that we're leading up to. Paulson said no, he would never put it in writing. He said because, and this is his words, Paulson's words, he said, that would be a disclosable event, and we do not want a disclosable event, end quote. Well, I don't know if that strikes most people as hard as it strikes me, but when you just think about that statement, this is typical of what goes on in government and banking more and more. People make deals, under-the-table deals, or behind-closed-doors deals, and they don't want anything in writing so they can deny it, so they can say that's not true. They can say, oh, it's just a conspiracy theory, and all of that sort of thing. In other words, we do not have a transparent government, and certainly when it relates to banking, we don't have any transparency at all. Everything is a non-disclosable event. And that becomes important a year or so later when these banks and the Treasury Secretary are telling the American people that everything has worked out just fine. The banks are paying back their loans. General Motors is paying back its loans. They're floating stock and so forth, and they're selling stock, and the old free enterprise capitalist system is kicking in, and isn't it a good thing we did this? And you know what? That's all just smoke and mirrors. Can I prove it? No, because it's a non-disclosable event, you see. There's nothing in writing, but we know just by looking at the balance sheets of these corporations and these banks, they are not making enough money, enough profit to pay back those huge, huge bailouts. They just aren't making it. In fact, in most cases, they're continuing to dip into the muck. So where's the money coming from? Well, in my view, it's a non-disclosable event. The money is coming from a deal, a promise made by the Federal Reserve System to these banks and corporations that they will provide the money. In other words, they will make new loans or new bailouts off the record that nobody knows about in order for them to publicly pay off the old bailouts and make them all look good. And that, in a nutshell, is the game that's being played as we speak.
I want to come back to that for a moment, but, you talk about in your book this sort of fusion that we see between the banking cartel, the government, the Federal Reserve, and Henry Paulson epitomized that. First of all, he was the former head of Goldman Sachs. He arranged the sale of Bear Stearns to J.P. Morgan Chase. He allowed Lehman Brothers to collapse, forced the absorption of Merrill Lynch into Bank of America. So at the end of the day, you only had two giants left standing, both Goldman and Morgan. Now I want to move on to this repayment. I want to get into more detail because we saw the press conferences. The president said, the taxpayers made a return on their investment. And when it came to, for example, December 2009, Bank of America announced it repaid its $45 billion loan from the Treasury. However, if you look at the examination act, the source of the money was said to be cash reserves in the sale of new stock. Well, number one, they didn't sell enough new stock. And if you look at their cash reserves, they had loans that were continuing to go sour. Defaults had tripled from the first quarter to the third. Bad loans were up 15%. So how can a company that is losing money, has bigger write-offs, loan loss reserves are increasing and they tripled, and all of a sudden, magically, they come up with $45 billion?
Well, of course, it's impossible. So the question is, where is the money coming from and what channel? We know where it's coming from. It's coming from you and from me. It's coming from the taxpayers. But what is the channel through which it is being flowed? And I suspect that it's coming through the Federal Reserve as a form of a grant or a credit guarantee so that some of the large investment funds can buy this stock. Or the evidence is beginning to percolate out now that perhaps the Federal Reserve itself is buying the stock. There's really nothing that stops it from doing that if it wants to. And, judging by the record of these, the word comes to mind, crooks. Judging by the record of these people, there's nothing to give you any assurance that's not what they're doing. They're just probably buying the stocks of General Motors and these banks themselves and creating the money out of nothing, which means it's going to come from the taxpayers through inflation. But meanwhile, they can get on television and crow about how wonderful it was and how wise they were and what great decisions those were. Meanwhile, the big black birds are still up there flying and they haven't come home to roost yet.
And another example of this is we saw the bailout of the automobile companies. Figures for GM were astronomical. But we had press conferences like the repayment of the loans for Bank of America. You had General Motors that was repaying the government, but if you look closely, they were repaying the first loans with the second loans that they were getting. In other words, they weren't repaying the taxpayers or the government for money that they were making selling cars.
That's the point, exactly. They're just new loans for old, and the new loans had to be bigger than the old, so the problem is just, it's not solved, it's postponed, put off a little bit more into the future, and it grows. And
you bring up a point, and I want to tie this into what I think is the next round in this kind of scheme. And you point out that what the government funds, it controls, and what it controls, it owns. And there was a speech that Tim Geithner made that he said he's prepared to oust any CEO of any bank that received a bailout if he doesn't run the bank correctly. Now, the states in this country, many of them are running huge, monstrous deficits. My own state of California, our own state being one of them. Now, if the federal government starts bailing out the states, do the states, in essence, lose their sovereignty? Because going back to your statement, what the government funds, it controls, and what it controls, it effectively owns.
Well, yes, I think that's an obvious thing if you just spend a moment or two contemplating that. The states, and increasingly now even the counties and cities in this country, are all bankrupt. Not all, but increasingly bankrupt. And they find that they cannot cover their losses through increasing taxes. And so they're turning to the federal government, and you know what? Those guys in Washington are perfectly happy to create the money out of nothing. It doesn't cost them anything. They just go to the Federal Reserve, and a little teamwork kicks in there, and they create these billions or trillions of dollars taken from the American people through inflation, which is, we haven't seen anything yet, but it's coming because of this. And they'll give it to the states and to the cities. And meanwhile, there will be strings attached. And from that point forward, any idea of states in particular, flexing their muscle and say, no, we're going to nullify this act from the federal government, or we're going to stand against the federal government on this issue and that issue because we are sovereign states according to the Constitution and all that sort of thing, which is true, becoming less so with each passing year, as the states have already accepted tremendous amounts of money from the federal government, and those have carried a lot of conditions with them. But once the federal government starts to bail out the states in toto, in terms of billions of dollars, I think that's pretty much the end of the line of the old concept of states' rights. Now we've taken that final step to where we have just one massive central government, pretty much on the Soviet model.
I want to go forward, and you've updated one of your last chapters in the book, and you call it the Doomsday Mechanism. And by 2008, and I would say by 2010, the U.S. government was over 1/4 of the nation's economy. More people today work for the government than for all of the manufacturing companies in the private sector. There are more bank regulators than there are bankers. There are now more Farm Bureau workers than there are farmers. There are more welfare administrators than recipients, and more citizens receive government checks than those who pay the income taxes. When people can vote for a transfer of wealth to themselves, in other words, when you have government and entitlement recipients greater in number than those who pay the taxes, isn't the system doomed to fail? Because how can you create wealth in that environment?
Well, you cannot create wealth in that environment, and yes, the system is doomed to fail. We've known that all along. People don't want to face it, and they'll say, oh, what a doom and gloomer you are. Well, we've been through this problem before. We've always come out of it. We're America. Don't worry about it, you know. Well, things are different now than they used to be. For one thing, we have come out of depressions before, but in those days we had the semblance of a free enterprise system. Today, the command economy has taken over. There's no free enterprise left. Let's face it. Let's get realistic. Everything you buy out there in the market is predominantly controlled. The industries are cartelized. They're all regulated, so-called, by the government. There's no competition. Remember, in the Great Depression of 1929 and the 30s, people who had money had something of value. Money was greatly valued in those days. If you saved money, you were king. You were able to buy things that nobody else could have because they had no money. Well, today, you see, it's just the opposite. Money is the problem. They're printing money out of nothing. Back in the 1930s, you couldn't just print money out of nothing because it was backed to a certain degree by gold and silver. So the quantity was limited. It was worth something. Today, there's nothing backing the money, so these guys can literally create it out of nothing as much as they want. They can just keep those printing presses and those computer digits flowing forever, and there's nothing to stop them. So today, people are trying to get rid of money because they know that money is losing its value every day. They're trying to switch from money into hard assets, like gold or silver or real estate or inventories or things like that. So it's a different game now. Just because we have recovered in the past, that was because we had the semblance of free enterprise competition, a free market at work then. And you can do it under those conditions. But today we don't. Today, through the Republican Party and the Democrat Party working together back and forth, seesawing us into a command economy, now we just don't have that stability and that stamina yet. And so getting back to the original statement, I personally believe that, yes, the system is doomed. There is no way to save it. It's got to go its full course. It will collapse, and that's a very, very depressing thought because it means that the government will become even more powerful, and we will probably all wind up working for the government, directly or indirectly, if that's not already the case. And we'll be told where to live, what jobs we can have, what we're paid, how much food we can have, what kind of food, what kind of education. We'll get our health care, but we're told what kind of health care, and everything from top to bottom. Probably the only freedom we'll have left is what color socks to wear.
You know, it's interesting because it is maybe hard to believe, as that may sound for many of our listeners here, when you consider that in the fall of 2008, government took over Fannie and Freddie, which accounts for, 80% of lending. So if the government owns Fannie and Freddie, and if you think about it, you own a house, you've got an FHA or government mortgage on it, your payments to live in your home are paid to the government, along with your taxes, along with your Social Security, along with state taxes. You really have become, like Hayek, we're heading down the road to serfdom if we continue along this line.
Yeah, there's no question about it. And it's one of those unthinkable, unspeakable realities. Nobody wants to talk about it because that brings up some very unpleasant projections into the future. And, we're fun-loving people. We don't want to hurt anybody. We don't want to suffer. We like everything to be rosy. So Don't talk to me about those bad things, That's the American mindset. And so as long as we have that mindset, there isn't a chance in the world that we're going to solve the problem. First of all, we have to recognize, face on, reality. What is the problem? And then, maybe then, we have a chance at solving.
Mr. Griffin, as I look at this, and the United States today is involved in 2 wars, we have a future entitlement problem that amounts to well over $100 trillion if you take all our debt and our unfunded liabilities. Right now we're borrowing 40% out of every dollar the government spends. The government now makes up 26% of the economy. How long are we going to be able to continue this before ultimately the dollar collapses? And as I read the tea leaves and I look at the international organizations, you read foreign affairs, we seem to be moving towards a global central bank and a global currency. Would you agree?
Oh, totally agree. We've been doing that for, I'm just going to say, at least 3 decades. That has been the plan for as long as I can recall reading the literature of these people who are now running the system. Some of them are long visionaries. They think long ahead. And they've been talking from the turn of the last century, actually, about the building of this global network of governments. They call it the New World Order. That's the word they have given to it. And they look to it, forward to it with great anticipation. And they all agree that before you can have a New World Order based on the model of collectivism, which means total control over the society, before you can do that, you have to have a central money system, not all these national currencies. You've got to have one central world money system, and they've talked about that for many, many, many years. So we have been moving toward it for a long time, but yes, of late you can certainly see it. Almost every day when you open up the newspaper, you find some article about some pundit or some political figure, either here in America or overseas, talking about, the time has come. We've got to transist away from the American dollar into an international currency, maybe a regional currency, for the North American Union, as they like to call it, the merger of the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Maybe they'll call it the AMERO, which is what they're talking about. Maybe they'll go directly to an international currency. We don't know, but we know that's where it's headed.
So when you decided to publish your 5th edition, which has come out, and by the way, I was glad to see it on the list of books at Barnes & Noble, what prompted you to bring this book out again? You've updated it. You've updated the mechanism. Is it because more of what you see is just accelerating the trends that you first wrote about in your first edition?
Well, that's true, but there are several motives for that, Jim. Every time we print this book, which this is now, we're at the printers now for our 29th printing. It's amazing. Every time we do that, we try and update the book and bring the current statistics up to current status and, put new facts in that are pertinent. We've been doing that ever since the book was first published in 1994. But at certain places along the way that we consider to be milestones, we just sort of decide to call it another edition, which means we have got to go through the whole business of copywriting and getting ISBN numbers and so forth. But there's really not much difference from one printing to the next, whether it straddles an edition or not, because each of the printings is a considerable update. And the motive for that is just to make sure that this book doesn't become irrelevant. It's hard to imagine, because even if you read the first printing, the first edition, it's terribly relevant. There has not been a lot of things changed at the fundamental level, just the data, statistics, names, and events, that's all.
Well, it's absolutely amazing, because if I could sum up, you're seeing widespread nationalization of industry, from housing to mortgage lending to the financial service industry. And, we get this appearance that things are getting better, that loans are being repaid, when actually things are getting worse. The government is spending money. We're now running perennially trillion-dollar deficits. The debt limit is going to have to be voted on. They're going to have to extend it beyond $14 trillion. The Fed's printing more money. It seems like your doomsday mechanism is accelerated into high gear.
Yeah, I'm very sad to see that my predictions were right. Not exactly predictions. Those were whimsical projections into the future. And, that chapter, the doomsday mechanism and pessimistic scenario, is startlingly accurate. I haven't really read that for quite a while until it was time to revise the book this last time. I didn't really need to go read that chapter again. But when I sat down and did, I was amazed. I called my wife in. His name is Pat. I said, Pat, come here, listen to this. And I'm reading from my own book. And I'd forgotten that I had written it so accurately back in 1994 that those things actually have come to pass so closely, including even using some of the same language. I envision what these politicians would say in order to try and justify their schemes. What would they say to sell them to the American people? So I'd invent some phrase, and by golly, that's exactly the same phrase they have been using in the last few months.
Well, it's absolutely amazing. Very prescient, considering that you wrote this in the mid-'90s. Well, Mr. Griffin, I want to thank you for joining us on the Financial Sense Newshour. The name of the book is called The Creature from Jekyll Island, a second look at the Federal Reserve by G. Edward Griffin. We've been speaking with its author, and I highly recommend you pick up a copy. It is pertinent today as when it was originally written, and it is now updated. Mr. Griffin, all the best to you.
Well, thank you, and have a great New Year.
You too.